The argument began at a family dinner inside my grandfather's red brick home in Louisville. It was the kind of night where every unspoken tension seemed to gather around the table. My name is Justine Farrell, and I was 34 when everything finally unraveled. I sat across from my sister with my parents beside her, watching the tight smile on her face as she tapped her fork against her glass in that familiar way that always demanded attention. The room fell silent the moment she pushed her chair back and stood up. Her voice cut through the air without hesitation. "I'm selling Grandpa's house. You get nothing." My parents nodded with a certainty that stunned me, a silent confirmation that they had already chosen their side long before tonight. For a split second I wondered if I had misunderstood them, but the look they exchanged said everything. My pulse rose, yet my voice stayed steady as I leaned forward. "Have you checked whose name is on the current property deed?" She let out a short laugh, filled with confidence rather than humor. "Of course, it's—" She didn't even finish her sentence before I pulled a thick folder from my bag, placed it on the table, and pushed it toward her with enough force to stop every whisper in the room. The moment she opened the first page, chairs scraped, voices rose, and the entire dinner erupted into chaos. If you want to understand why that single moment shattered every bond in my family, stay with me and follow the story from the beginning. Remember to subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of these real family twists. A year earlier, things were quieter between us. The distance that would eventually split the family had not yet surfaced, although I could sense a subtle change forming beneath the surface. During that period, my grandfather Arthur Farrell remained the steady presence he had always been. I visited him whenever I could, because those afternoons had become an anchor in a life that sometimes felt unpredictable. He had a calm way of speaking that made even the most ordinary stories feel important, and I often left his home with the impression that he had given me something intangible to hold on to. Grandpa enjoyed revisiting moments from his childhood or sharing anecdotes about relatives I had never met. His stories never revolved around possessions or obligations. Instead, he focused on the way people shaped one another over time. Whenever I settled into the old chair across from him, he spoke with a warmth that reassured me he valued those visits in a way that went beyond routine family duty. At times, he paused during a story and fixed his eyes on me as if he saw a question I had not asked. One afternoon, after finishing a memory about his early years in Louisville, he placed his hand on mine for a brief moment and said, "One day you will understand what I mean, Justine." He did not offer more, and I respected that choice because it felt intentional rather than cryptic. My sister Lindsay rarely appeared during those visits. Her absence did not surprise me because she had always kept a certain distance from Grandpa. Over the course of that year, however, the distance between her and me became more pronounced. There was no single argument or dramatic shift that explained the divide. It grew steadily, shaped by moments that might have seemed insignificant to others, but felt heavy when repeated over time. I noticed it in the way she changed her tone whenever I entered a room, or in the subtle eye roll she tried to hide whenever Grandpa complimented my patience. During occasional family meals, Lindsay released sharp comments that carried more sting than humor. They often targeted the things I had worked hard for, or implied that my choices lacked ambition compared to hers. Instead of acknowledging her words, my parents brushed them aside as if they had not heard anything worth addressing. The silence that followed those moments became its own form of message because it allowed the remarks to linger without consequence. My parents believed that avoiding conflict preserved harmony, although their avoidance created a space where Lindsay learned she could say anything without being challenged. My relationship with Grandpa acted as a counterweight to the tension. He never told me what he thought about Lindsay's behavior, yet he observed more than he commented. When I asked him about it once, he smiled gently and shifted the conversation back to a story about his youth. I did not press the matter because I sensed that he wanted me to form my own understanding rather than rely on his interpretation. His approach gave me clarity without directly addressing the conflict, which I appreciated more as the months passed. As the year continued, Lindsay's attitude sharpened in ways that felt deliberate. There were days when she treated me as if my presence created an inconvenience she could barely tolerate. The shift confused me because nothing obvious had changed between us. She adopted a tone that disguised criticism as casual remarks, and those remarks increased whenever my parents were nearby. They reacted with a mixture of discomfort and denial, hoping that the tension would fade on its own. Their refusal to acknowledge the problem allowed Lindsay to create a hierarchy she believed everyone should respect. I learned to navigate those gatherings by focusing on Grandpa. Spending time with him grounded me in a way that softened the sting of Lindsay's behavior. Whenever I left his home, I felt steadier, as though the unspoken message behind his stories equipped me with patience for whatever waited outside his door. I did not know then how significant those moments would become, nor did I understand the weight of his quiet statement. I only knew that something in our family was shifting, and the shape of that shift would eventually force truths into the open that none of us were prepared to face. A few months later, the tension quietly grew into something sharper than I expected. It did not begin with a fight or a disagreement. It began with small shifts in behavior that only made sense when placed next to each other. Lindsay Hall suddenly developed an unusual interest in the old boxes stored in my grandfather's study. She asked questions that felt rehearsed, and the tone she used made it clear that her curiosity had nothing to do with nostalgia. She wanted information, although she never explained what she hoped to find. Each time I asked her why she needed those documents, she brushed me off with a quick remark that suggested I should stop overthinking everything. My parents did not seem bothered by her attitude. They agreed with whatever she brought up and treated her concerns as if they carried some urgent importance. Watching their responses gave me a sinking feeling because the favoritism became more obvious with each passing week. Whenever Lindsay hinted that certain things in the house had been ignored for too long, Mom nodded while Dad repeated that she had always been more responsible. They said these things with a softness that suggested they believed it, even though her involvement in family matters had always been inconsistent. One weekend, my parents called for a small family meeting. They claimed it was to discuss practical issues, but everything shifted toward Lindsay the moment we sat down. She brought up the condition of my grandfather's home with an irritated tone and implied that someone had allowed things to fall behind. Her complaints did not match reality, and she spoke as if I should have been taking care of tasks I had never been assigned. The way she framed each sentence revealed that she had prepared her lines long before we sat at the table. I tried to understand what had triggered this sudden need for control, but she offered no explanation. Around that time, I crossed paths with Mrs. Cole, a longtime neighbor who knew everyone in the community. She mentioned that Lindsay had stopped by her porch and asked questions about local real estate agents. According to her, Lindsay claimed she was asking for fun. The claim did not match her behavior yet. I knew better than to confront her with secondhand information. I thanked Mrs. Cole and walked away with a quiet certainty that something had changed on a deeper level. Lindsay was exploring possibilities she had no reason to explore, at least not openly. The situation became more complicated when my sister's husband, Jason Hall, stepped into conversations that never involved him. He appeared during casual visits and inserted opinions about how families should manage important decisions. Jason had always been polite in the past, but his tone shifted into something heavier. He spoke like someone who believed his words carried authority, although no one had asked for his guidance. My attempts to redirect the conversation failed because Lindsay insisted that he should contribute since he was part of the family. The more he spoke, the more I recognized that he was not simply voicing opinions. He was influencing her perspective in ways that felt intrusive. I noticed the change most clearly when Lindsay criticized minor issues with the house during a Sunday visit. She questioned choices that had never concerned her before. The rhythm of her complaints revealed a desire to control something she had ignored for years. My parents reacted with the same approving nods that had become predictable, which made her feel even more certain of her authority. I kept quiet while observing her posture, her expressions, and the confidence in her voice. None of it felt natural. It felt like she had decided on a direction long before anyone else realized there was even a path. By the end of that month, I sensed that whatever she was planning had nothing to do with helping the family. It had everything to do with power, and I did not yet understand why she wanted it so badly. One winter afternoon, everything changed in a way that felt both sudden and impossible to absorb. The call came from Mom, and even before she spoke, the tone of her breathing told me that something irreversible had happened. My grandfather was gone. She did not explain the details, and I did not ask because the finality of her voice left no room for anything except the reality that our family had just lost its anchor. I drove to his home in silence, trying to prepare for the shift I sensed approaching, even though I had no idea how deep it would cut. The days that followed moved in a blur as relatives arrived to pay their respects. At the small service held for him, Lindsay positioned herself as if she were the one responsible for guiding everyone through the loss. She greeted guests with a careful tone and behaved as though she had been the closest to him, even though she had spent more time away than present. I watched the way Mom and Dad responded to her presence, and their expressions suggested that they believed her performance reflected genuine leadership. It unsettled me because the distance between her actions and her true involvement felt too wide to ignore. After the service, my parents made a decision without asking for my input. They insisted that Lindsay should move into Grandpa's home for a short period to take care of practical matters. They called it temporary management, although they never defined what needed to be managed. Within 2 weeks, she had moved in with Jason, and the tone of her messages shifted into something more authoritative. She claimed she needed space to organize things, yet she rarely updated anyone about what she was doing. I visited the house not long after she settled in, and noticed that several rooms had already begun to show signs of neglect. Items that Grandpa had always kept in order were scattered, and small tasks that required attention were ignored. Lindsay brushed off my concerns and claimed she had everything under control. The confidence in her voice did not match the state of the house, and I began to wonder whether she was overwhelmed or simply uninterested in handling the responsibilities she insisted on taking. During one of my visits, I noticed a few folders stacked on a table near his favorite chair. They contained documents he referenced throughout the years, the kind he kept close because they mattered to him. I did not open them because I knew I would need the right moment to understand their purpose. Something inside me shifted when I saw them. It was not suspicion or fear. It was recognition. Grandpa had left pieces of himself throughout the house, and those pieces were becoming harder to protect. As the weeks passed, the distance within our family grew sharper. Mom deferred to Lindsay for decisions that never required her input in the past. Dad followed the same pattern with a quiet acceptance that felt rehearsed. Every conversation became heavier, and the sense of unity that had once felt natural seemed to dissolve. By the end of that winter, I realized that the loss of my grandfather was not the only fracture we were facing. Something else was breaking, and this time it ran through all of us. About a month later, Lindsay called for a family meeting that she claimed was necessary to move things forward. I remember sitting at the oval kitchen table in Grandpa's house while Mom and Dad took their usual seats, and Lindsay acted as if she were running a formal briefing. She barely looked at me before announcing that the place needed major repairs if we ever wanted it to be useful, which was her way of preparing everyone for the idea of selling. She described the roof, the basement, and the porch as if she had been maintaining them for years, even though she had only been inside the house long enough to toss her bags into the guest room. Jason, her husband, joined the meeting as if he had been personally invited to manage our family's affairs. This was the first time I mentioned his presence in this narrative, so I should say that Jason Keller had a habit of speaking with the confidence of someone who believed every issue needed his direction. He warned us that unexpected bills would overwhelm us if we did not make a decision soon, and he hinted at financial pressure he and Lindsay were dealing with. His tone suggested that the house was their solution, rather than a responsibility they had chosen to handle. My parents agreed with almost everything Lindsay proposed. Mom folded her hands whenever Lindsay made a point, while Dad only added that it would be easier for everyone if we trusted Lindsay's judgment. I felt the familiar imbalance settle in, as if my role was to listen quietly, while decisions shaped the future of a place that carried years of our family's memories. I decided to observe rather than speak. In the weeks following the meeting, I spent time visiting the property on my own. I documented the leaks in the living room ceiling, the paint peeling along the back hallway, and the broken outside light that Lindsay had never fixed. I wanted to understand what had been neglected because it became obvious that the issues she blamed on age were the direct result of her own inattention. During one of my visits, Mrs. Cole approached me while watering the small flower bed near her porch. She mentioned that Lindsay had visited a local real estate office for a quick conversation, which she described with the kind of tone neighbors used when they had seen too much, yet pretended not to judge. When I asked what Lindsay wanted, Mrs. Cole explained that Lindsay had hinted at wanting a market estimate for future planning. It was not enough to accuse her of anything, yet it pushed my suspicions closer to something solid. I returned to the house that afternoon feeling the weight of clarity I had tried to ignore. The more I pieced together these moments, the more I recognized the echo of something Grandpa had once told me. I did not know the full meaning then, but his voice became sharper in my memory as Lindsay's behavior pointed toward intentions she believed no one could question. A quiet shift settled over me as the week began, a subtle feeling that something decisive would soon break through the confusion that had grown inside our family. I had no proof, only an instinct shaped by months of tension and half conversations that never reached clarity. That morning, Mom mentioned that my sister had been working hard on the house situation, a phrase that held an unusual weight because it rarely meant anything stable. A few hours later, a neighbor forwarded me a message that left no room for interpretation. Lindsay had already signed a contract with a potential buyer. She had done it on her own terms, even though she lacked the authority to approve any transfer. The information stunned me because it confirmed a risk I had feared without fully articulating it. The situation demanded verification, so I drove to the city property office without notifying anyone. Inside the office, I met an employee who reviewed my identification before retrieving the official property deed. He studied the document for a few moments, then placed it in front of me with a calm expression. The deed carried my name exactly as my grandfather had arranged. The certainty of it struck me harder than I expected because it transformed every conflict of the past months into something sharply defined. I thanked him and left with the document secured in my bag, determined to move forward with a clear plan rather than uncertainty. Later that day, I contacted my attorney, Nora Mitchell, to request a meeting. When I arrived at her office, she examined the deed carefully before outlining the legal steps required to protect the property from unauthorized contracts. Her approach was steady and analytical, which helped anchor my own resolve. She prepared a set of documents to invalidate any agreement my sister had attempted to form, and she emphasized the importance of maintaining thorough records of every interaction. I listened closely because her guidance offered a structure I had needed for far too long. Word of my actions reached Jason before the day ended. He waited for me outside my apartment and attempted to negotiate some form of compromise that would give Lindsay partial influence over the sale. His tone carried a mixture of urgency and calculation. I declined his offer without hesitation because the situation no longer allowed for blurred boundaries. Leaving things unresolved would only encourage further attempts to override decisions that were not theirs to make. The pressure increased when Mom and Dad called that evening. They insisted that cooperation would keep the family intact, although their definition of cooperation required my silence and compliance. I remained firm because their view of unity had gradually shifted into something conditional. The conversation ended without agreement, yet I felt steadier than before. I understood the weight of the decision placed on me, and I accepted it without regret. Everything was ready for whatever would come next. That evening carried a weight so distinct that I felt it settle before the front door even closed behind me, a slow tightening of something that had been waiting for its final pull. I already understood most of what would happen because every conversation over the past few weeks had moved toward the same unavoidable point. The dinner was only the place where it would finally surface without restraint. My parents greeted me with a politeness stiff enough to reveal their discomfort. Lindsay and Jason sat across from them both, wearing an expression that suggested they had spent the past hour rehearsing how to corner me, without making it appear deliberate. I took my seat, choosing silence for the first moments because speaking too early would only give them another angle to twist. The food had barely been served when Lindsay leaned back and addressed me with a tone sharpened by certainty. She informed me that I needed to think about what is best for the family, as if the burden of responsibility belonged exclusively to me. She continued with remarks that made it clear she believed the house should be used to secure her plans, not Grandpa's wishes. Jason waited for her to finish before sliding a folder toward me. His smile carried the confidence of someone who assumed the outcome was already guaranteed. He presented what he called their final proposal, a suggestion that I step aside in exchange for a share of the sale. His voice lowered when he added that agreeing now would spare everyone unnecessary trouble. I recognized the pressure beneath his calm phrasing, a thinly disguised attempt to intimidate me without admitting it outright. Mom attempted to support their position, insisting that unity meant cooperation, and Dad echoed her sentiment with a firmness meant to talk over my hesitation. They wanted me to yield for the sake of harmony, but harmony had long disappeared the moment they accepted Lindsay's version of the story without question. Their insistence only emphasized how little space they were willing to grant my perspective. While they spoke, Grandpa's voice returned to me with quiet clarity. "One day, you'll understand what I mean, Justine." I had not known what he intended then, but the truth had unfolded piece by piece since the day I visited the property office. Remembering him gave me the steadiness I needed to listen without being pulled into their urgency. The discussion circled for several minutes, each attempt to pressure me more direct than the last. Lindsay finally pushed her chair back and rose to her feet, clearly frustrated that subtlety had not produced the result she wanted. She raised her chin and lifted her voice so there would be no mistaking her declaration. "I'm selling Grandpa's house. You get nothing." Her certainty filled the room. She fully expected no resistance. She believed the evening belonged to her. She had no idea I had already prepared the folder inside my bag, the one that would shift every word spoken at that table. As she stood over me, ready to dictate the next step, I reached for it with a calmness that came from knowing the truth was no longer in question. Everything that had been building would collide in the next moment, the same moment that led into the scene where this story began. After the files hit the table, the room slipped into a stunned silence that carried a weight none of them expected. Lindsay reached for the top document with the unsteady posture of someone who already sensed a truth she had spent months refusing to consider. She scanned the page, returned to the signatures, then looked at me with an expression that revealed real panic rather than the practiced indignation she often used to win arguments. Her voice cracked as she tried to reason through her disbelief, yet the facts in front of her refused to bend. My attorney Nora Mitchell entered the living room after receiving my message. She carried the certification from the property office and spoke with a calm tone that contrasted sharply with the rising tension around us. Nora explained the verification process, outlined the legal standards used to validate each signature, and confirmed that every detail matched the regulations applied by the county. Her explanation left no room for negotiation, which pushed the atmosphere toward a confrontation the others could no longer avoid. Dr. Alan Reed, my grandfather's physician, arrived soon after. He had treated Grandpa for years and had witnessed every stage of his health during the period when the documents were signed. Dr. Reed confirmed that Grandpa remained fully capable of making decisions and that no concerns about cognitive decline had ever been raised. His statement dissolved the final argument Lindsay had relied on and exposed how fragile her claim had always been. The buyer who had signed the unauthorized contract with Lindsay filed an immediate complaint against her and Jason. They faced penalties for misrepresentation and for entering a transaction without proper ownership. Their financial situation grew worse as legal fees accumulated, which added pressure they could not deflect toward me now that the truth was documented in front of them. Several relatives who had once tolerated their behavior distanced themselves after witnessing the willingness to deceive the family for personal gain. I told everyone I was done with the conflict and no longer wanted a relationship built on manipulation. Lindsay tried to appeal to Mom and Dad for support, yet even they struggled to defend her after seeing the consequences she and Jason brought upon themselves. I gathered the documents, thanked Nora and Dr. Reed, and walked out with the certainty that the boundaries I set would remain firm. This experience taught me how easily family loyalty can become distorted when entitlement replaces integrity. I learned that protecting what someone trusted you with is a responsibility that demands clarity, courage, and restraint, especially when others attempt to twist the truth for personal benefit. Standing firm in the face of pressure can feel isolating, yet it is often the only path that preserves self-respect and honors the intentions of those who acted with genuine care. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. Your time and attention mean more than you realize, and I appreciate every person who listens with an open heart. I hope my experience encourages you to reflect on your own boundaries and the value of fairness. Share your thoughts in the comments because your perspective adds meaning to every chapter we explore together.